Hello and welcome everybody to another VITA Learning webinar. Today we've got Peter Peasy. How you doing, Peter?
Good day for you. Good to see you.
Good, excellent. Glad to see you too as well. Being on the East Coast, we're on the West Coast, so we're from coast to coast here today. Today we are going to have Peter talk about the effects of enamel translucency, which is always a hot topic. We get a lot of calls in. Peter, I'm sure you get a lot of questions on, well, how do I create this translucency, create that translucency, and it still seems to be a mystery in our industry.
Yeah, well, it's a nice challenge that you presented for me, so I'm looking forward to it.
We're always open to challenges, aren't we?
Yes.
Just some quick notes for the audience. Your phone is on mute, so if you have a question, go ahead and use that panel box on the right-hand side under questions. Type in your questions, send them in, and we will either do it, I'll interrupt Peter briefly and ask him a question if it's pertinent to just that specific topic, or we'll wait until the end of the webinar to go over this. And then this webinar will be recorded. It will be posted. Give us a couple days. It'll be posted on our VITA YouTube channel, VITA North America YouTube channel. We've got all of Peter's previous webinars on there, some videos and so forth. So please check that out when you get a chance as well. So again, as we mentioned, effects of enamel translucency. Peter, it's always good to have you with us. Peter's a worldwide dental educator for technicians, dentists, and auxiliaries. He's an owner and manager of Peasy Dental Studios, Incorporated in Staten Island, New York. Has a personal appreciation and expertise on all phases of clinical, laboratory, traditional, digital techniques, color communication, and digital photography. For me nowadays, the traditional is the key. That we're losing so many technicians, Peter, that are losing that concept of old traditional and not bringing it into their digital world. I think you got to understand both the history and today's digital dental technology as well to compete nowadays. Is a board member of the Association of Master Dental Technicians, teacher, educator in the Master Dental Technician program at NYU, faculty member as well at the School of Dentistry at NYU, member of the American Academy of Aesthetic Dentistry, which is not easy to become a member of, executive board member and fellow of the Northeastern Naphthological Society, editor-in-chief of Inside Dental Technology, a very nice book for our market. Also ACP Technician of the Year in 2018. So with that said, Peter, I am going to turn it over to you and we can get going. So I am going to make you the presenter. And thank you again, Peter, for your time spending with us to go over this topic.
Let me know that you have everything. Let's see, we're good there?
Right. I do. I see your front first picture, yes. We are good. All
okay.
Right. Holler if you need me anything.
Make sure this is working now. Great. Okay. So thank you for the topic, by the way. This was kind of a topic that I think Jim picked out, which, yes, I get a lot of questions about it, but it is an interesting topic and nice to be back. We haven't done a webinar, I think, in a month or two now. So I guess squeezing one in August worked out. So thank you, Jim. And we have a good amount of people here, which is always nice. I'm coming from my office currently right now, and I usually start off by kind of welcoming you into my office. This is my main laboratory that you're looking at. Upstairs is my teaching center, and also, as Jim mentioned, I'm the editor-in-chief of Inside Dental Technology, which I'm currently trying to finish up my editorial. That's 4 days late at this moment, so hopefully I can get that done tonight and get it over there in time. Last minute technician as usual. Talking about the effects of enamel and translucency, I think is interesting because I feel like it's probably one of the things we talk the least about, right? We're always talking about chromas and value and mamelons and shapes, and all those things are really, really important. I don't want to pretend they're not. But I think what we've lost sight of over the years is that part of the process of ceramics, when we make a dented material, an opacious dented material, a mamelon material, or even an enamel material, is that they all work somewhat together. One of them is not as useful without the other, right? It's like having, you know, half the players in a chess game and not having all of the players that you need. Each one of them play a critical role. One of those roles the enamels play is functionality. And I think that's an area that we kind of skip over a lot of times, is the functional necessity of the enamel. And then obviously the other one is the aesthetic value of the enamel and how we actually see what we see and what the enamel actually does for us as we're looking through the process. And obviously there's more to it than just the enamel itself, the surface topography, the coloration behind it. But I kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit. So I'll just start off with a basic case. Nice lady presented. She was missing a number 10. An implant was going to be placed, and when she presented, she was wearing a flipper over and over again. And she got tired of wearing the flipper, although she liked the basic shape and the basic coloration of it. Obviously, she didn't like some of the black triangle and the fact that she had to place the flipper in and out of the mouth. So as we worked our way through the case on Amy, we did all the normal things that Jim kind of mentioned before, the key photography, the color communications. I think I've gone through that in many webinars over the last year or two, so I don't want to skip it, but at the same time, I think you get the concept at this point, or I hope you do. If you don't, then you can obviously go back and watch some other webinars on it. But one of the mistakes that we do make when we're transferring color and communication is the picture that you see right here on your screen right now. There's an edentulous area. The doctor put a shade tab in between the edentulous area, and that's supposed to be a color reference for us. So I'm going to tell you that is not a color reference. That is actually probably the worst version of color reference that we have. Why? The eye does not see color in horizontal lines. It sees much better in verticals. And what happens is when you fill the edentulous space with a shade tab, you're not really giving us the accurate information. So I'm going to tell you, make sure your doctors avoid this. What I really want is the opposite. I want the contralateral side. If I'm doing lateral to lateral, I'm always looking at the contralateral side as my informational peak. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't want the adjacent teeth, the cuspid and the central next to it. Of course I do. I also would want the lower teeth below it. But realistically, when I do central to central, I'm trying to make those match as close as possible shade-wise. I go lateral to lateral. I try to make those match as close as possible, and then cuspid to cuspid and bi to bi. So I'm not really looking at matching just one tooth on one side. I'm looking at the whole arch, and I always want the contralateral information most of the time when I'm working through these cases. So an implant was placed on Amy. And normally when we do these kind of implant cases, by the way, we provide some information. Kian does a lot of work with this. So we actually make an implant jig, and that's made on the cast. So the doctor can actually take the abutment off the cast with the jig and place it into the mouth, and that verifies a lot of the fit and the information. We also make them what we call as a little cement plunger. So that little Darley jig you see there is basically just a plunger to put in and out of the crown. And what that does is, as most of you know from probably many of my lectures before, it's cementation. That's the #1 cause of implant failure. So we want to make sure there's not excess cement that's placed inside the crown when it's cemented. And we also want to make sure that the marginal integrity or the position of the margin is not more than 0.5 tenths of a millimeter below the tissue. And those are just the standard steps that we follow. So you can see the jig comes off the model, that goes straight into the patient's mouth. And everything seems fine until it's not. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the picture to your left of the screen, you'll notice that when I designed our margin, that margin was designed exactly 0.5 of a millimeter below the patient's tissue. Well, she had been wearing a flipper, and part of the challenge of the flipper was the pressure on the tissue. And after the implant was placed, she actually lost more tissue. So you can see to the right of your screen that now I'm actually getting my marginal finish line showing, and I'm going to have to drop that marginal finish line to make it accurate. So not a problem. The case will come back to me. I'll drop that marginal finish line. Some of you may ask, so I'll jump to the question before you do. A lot of times when we are doing these cementables, because we can't make them angulated and screw retained, which I would rather, we're using metal cast abutments and we're opaquing the abutment. This way we have the ability to use zirconia or lithium disilicate or whatever restoration we want. So in this particular case, all we had to do was drop the margin and re-opaque the abutment and then make our final coping. So this was on the try-in, obviously, and you can see that the margin placement was wrong, the coloration was a little bit off, no problem. That'll come back to the lab, we make a new jig, we adjust the abutment to where we want it to be, and transfer all that information back to the doctor for the final insert. The doctor inserts that. What you should notice too at this moment is that is partially the aesthetic parameters that we're looking for, but there are functional parameters in there, right? I want to make sure that I'm not hitting too hard on that implant position. I want to make sure the laterals are usually the #1 tooth to chip or break most of the time when you're having problems. So I want to make sure we're avoiding all the cross-arch interferences. And then in the end, what I'm really looking for is the functional and the aesthetic outcome. Now, to make this aesthetic, it wasn't really just about the coloration, it's also about the light transmission and the aesthetics of the translucency, and that's what our kind of focus is going to be on for our time together. So first we'll start with the protective part. Enamel protects the tooth. The goal of the enamel is the hardest part of the tooth. It is basically its protecting mechanism, and the more we age and the more wear and fatigue we have on the tooth, the more we wear through that enamel. And as we wear through that enamel, you're actually losing the tooth protectorate. Also understand that if we would take all the enamel off the tooth, the dentin itself is fairly flexible. It's not a very rigid material. So because it's so flexible, it's the enamel combination of rigidity and flexibility that make the tooth stronger and durable as we work through the process of chewing and eating and all the things that we do. You'll also notice that as you look at cross sections of teeth, that it's very interesting that the functional cusps, so the buccal cusps of the lower or the lingual cusp of the upper, actually have more enamel to them. Why? Because they're more protecting of the dentin and the pulpal chamber inside. So it's really more of a protective mechanism. Also, just to be clear on this kind of a subject, the maxillary dentin is actually softer than the mandibular dentin. So doctors will tell you if they're prepping out a tooth, and as they prep through the enamel and they get to the dentin, you actually slow down a little when you get to that maxillary dentin. Why? Because the dentin is softer and you can kind of grind through it or prep through it a lot faster. So you have to be careful about that. Now, you should be thinking, well, why is one softer than the other? They're all teeth. And it's really simple. And we kind of addressed this a little bit in one of the occlusion lectures that I think was the last one we did back in, I don't know, June or something. But the point of it is that the lower jaw has the ability to protect itself because of movement. It gets away from the tooth and it can rotate and move and go in any direction it wants. So its protecting mechanism is its movement. The maxillary jaw doesn't have the ability to move. It doesn't move, right? So because it doesn't move, the teeth need the ability to protect themselves. And they do that through two things. One, the movement of the tooth. That's why the contacts on the maxillary arch are a little bit lighter or a little less of a contact than you see on some of the lower teeth. And the flexibility of the tooth. It actually has a little bit more flexual rate to it. So that allows the teeth to be a little bit more protective because of the flexual mechanism and the ability that the lower is going to do its own protecting by moving in and out of the way. So we did kind of address this a little bit when we went to envelope, and I talked about where the lower incisal edge comes behind the upper incisal edge. And what's key here is that we have enamel, and that the enamel is not abrading against itself, but actually just protecting the lingual structure of the maxillary tooth and the facial and incisal structure of the mandibular teeth. And that all has to do with the envelope and the position that we work through. As we kind of start to repair teeth, we remove enamel. And if we're doing just the veneer, maybe we're not removing that much enamel, but we are removing some. And if you're following the concept that I just said to you, that enamel is the tooth protectorate. So the more of that enamel that I've removed, the more I've changed how the tooth has the ability to flex. And if I've changed the flexible rate of the tooth, that could be problematic for me. So one of the keys in diagnosing your cases is, especially when you're diagnosing them for Aesthetic values is to make sure that the first thing that I tend to look at is the linguals and the functional capability of the teeth. The minute I see that we've lost lingual enamel and the doctor is asking for an aesthetic fix, meaning they would like to do something simple, minimally invasive, or veneers, I know that we can't. And the reason we can't is because if I've lost lingual enamel and now I prep away the facial enamel, all that I actually have left is pulpal chamber and dentin. And that means now that the tooth has a very high flex rate to it. So the more enamel that's lost from the left of your screen to the middle of your screen to the right of your screen, the more there's an opportunity for us to go full coverage with our restorations. And I know that kind of defies our protocol today, right? Because everybody's talking about minimally invasive dentistry. Minimally invasive dentistry is fabulous, and we incorporate it everywhere and every time we can. But we also can't incorporate it just because we want to. And we have to be very aware of what the tooth structure is that we're working with and what our final goal is to protect the tooth. So the minute that I've lost enamel on both lingual and facial sides, my flexural rate of the tooth is very high. That means I'm getting a lot of movement in that tooth. So think about the concept. I have very little lingual enamel. I'm going to prep away the facial of the tooth, and I'm going to bond something harder on it. By the way, the harder might be zirconia, not zirconia, might be lithium silicate. I don't recommend zirconia veneers, although people are doing them, not my favorite. Most likely it's going to be lithium silicate or feldspathic. In feldspathic world, megapascal strength is appropriate to natural teeth, and the bond is very well, but it's still ceramic. And if there is no protectorate and the tooth has flex to it, there's a good chance you can crack and chip. Same thing works when you go to harder materials. So I'm going to use a harder material like a lithium disilicate or silicate. I'm going to bond that on, and you're saying, well, the material's harder, so that shouldn't chip or break. It shouldn't, but I still have a high flexural rate. And as I'm putting pressure on that tooth or that material, what's happening? We're losing the bond and we're getting secondary decay because we're going to start to get some of the breakdown of the cement underneath it if we don't get the chipping and breaking. There's got to be a failure mode without protecting the entire structure of the tooth. So big point here is functionally, make sure you understand the case diagnostics of where you're going, because the enamel is a tooth protectorant, and I want to make sure that when I'm done, my enamel is still protecting the tooth. Okay, aesthetically. Now I want you to start thinking of the enamel as something completely different. For me, the enamel is nothing more than a filter system. And what I'm trying to do is figure out how I want to filter the light in or out of my restoration. And I want to be clear about how I say that, because I think each of you over the years, some of you have probably spent some time with me, the webinars or courses, you know, I've kind of broken down the opacity of the dentins we use and the opacious dentins and some of the fluorescent materials. And the more and more translucent we get, well, that simply means that the more light can penetrate through that material. And as I get to the enamels and the translucents, they become very translucent. They become maybe 6 to 20 units of opacity, which means if I have an enamel, a basic enamel at 0.5 of a millimeter, that means that possibly almost 80% of the light actually goes through that enamel and it hits the dentin or the tooth underneath it, which means there's a lot of light passing through. Now, that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. The flaw with that is we don't always know what's behind that tooth, right? So if we're in a veneer, as an example, I'm going to tell you that as I'm designing a veneer, I know that I need 0.2 of a millimeter of enamel cervically up to about 0.5 of a millimeter of enamel towards the incisal edge. And by the way, this is standard for almost any layering concept that you're doing. If I'm building a thimble coping and layering opacious dentins and 90 different powders, in the end, after I've layered those 90 powders, I want 0.5 of a millimeter of some sort of translucency. What that translucency is, I'm purposely being a little vague at this moment, but I know I need to finish it with some sort of a translucency. On the other side of the coin, in the modern world that we're in now, where we're talking much more about minimally invasive dentistry, micro layering and structures, which are all great, and I'm doing that. In the end, I still need 0.2 to 0.5 millimeters of translucency. So if I'm micro layering a case, maybe I'm not using 90 powders inside, maybe I'm using 1 or 2 or only enamels. but I still have to keep the concept that I want my enamels to be 0.2 to 0.5 tenths of a millimeter. That's where I'm going to get the effect of the light transmission or reflection into the tooth. Let me explain this a little bit better so you have a better understanding of it. Thinking of enamel as a filtration system might be easier, but I want you to kind of understand how the enamel works. So what I've done here, and this is actually something I think my friend Adam did 15 years ago already, but it's still a great slide. If you look at the concept here, I have a bunch of pencils, and you can see this red, yellow, and you see some different colors and blues and greens around the eraser. And the goal here is I'm going to take some transparency. And when I say transparency, I'm talking about our most transparent materials. What would that be? The clears in your kit, in my kit, it's window, maybe a little bit of the neutral, but they're the most translucent or transparent materials that we have. And what I'm going to do with those materials is I'm going to make them in different thicknesses, 0.2 of a millimeter, 0.4 of a millimeter, 0.6 of a millimeter, and 0.8 of a millimeter. And when I cover over these yellows and colors that you see, watch what tends to happen. So the first thing you should notice is that the most translucent material, it does kind of lose value, right? Yes, I'm muting the yellow down, and I'm almost creating a slight grayish window to it. But also notice that the thicker I get, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, and 0.8, the more the value drops, meaning that, yes, I'm masking what's behind that, but it's also getting grayer and grayer. Why? Because transparency absorbs the light and lets a lot of it pass through it. And the thicker that transparency becomes, the more the value is going to drop on you. So you need to be very aware of that as you're picking and choosing your transparencies of the tooth that you're going to make. The other way to do this is go a little bit differently. And I could say, well, how about if I don't use transparency, I use translucency, or maybe a little bit of a milkier translucency, like a whiter enamel, like my Enamel or my Effect Pearl, or something that's a much whiter, my EE1. And I could do the same thing and make 0.2, 0.4, and 0.6 and 0.8. And now look what tends to happen. I'm masking the first 0.2 that you see there, and I'm not really losing value. But as I get thicker, now the light is going to react differently because it can't pass through the whiter transparency. And the thicker I get, I'm actually raising the value of what we see. Why? Because the light cannot pass through the enamel anymore because of its whiteness or brightness. So if you think of that filtration concept, the more translucent I am, or the more transparency is the right word I have, the more the value is going to drop. The more that I have a whiter or more brighter type of a translucency, the more I can reflect some of the light from the surface. And all that's really happening is exactly that. Transparency allows the light to go through. Translucency or whiteness can allow the light to hit and reflect back. In essence, I always use the example of this is bleaching, right? This is really kind of what bleaching does, where it kind of mocks that surface and reflects a lot of the light back. So can we raise value with our enamel? Yes. Is it the way we should go? Not always, right? We really want that value to be more inside, but I also want you to be aware that you can use that enamel to actually mask a little bit what's inside. And that was kind of the point of where I'm going with this. So if I'm using something very translucent on my facial 0.2 to 0.5, a lot of that light is going straight through the enamel and hitting what's behind it. What's behind it may be a natural tooth, it may be your micro-layered crown, or it may be your fully built crown. I don't know, but I do know that I'm going to get a lot of that light transmission through it. If I use something with more opacity or more white or brightness to it in my enamel, then I'm not going to get as much of the light going through. I'm going to get more reflection from the surface. So I kind of want to think of that concept as I'm working through my case. And by the way, when I work through my cases, I think most of you know that I built something called a canvas concept. And in that canvas, I'm usually looking at my chroma and my cervical, value in the middle third, then a certain amount of effect or translucency towards the incisal. Well, I want to treat my enamels exactly the same. If I want to increase my chroma in the cervical, maybe I'm going to use a very transparent type enamel that has a lot more color to it or chroma to it. This way I'm emphasizing the color in my cervical third. If I want something that I want to make a little brighter in the middle third, I'm going to use something more value-based, something whiter like EE1 or Pearl or whatever kit you're using, TI2, right? Something that's much more of a whiter reflective material. And then as I get towards the incisal edge, I might use a mix of several materials. Why? Because I might want some light to pass through, but not all of it. I might want to show the mamelons or not show the mamelons. So I have to really think through the process of what I want the light to do. And I always really want the light to have some absorption, because that's what the translucency's purpose is, but I also want it to have some reflection. So I'm not getting too much of my value dropping as I'm working through the light process, okay? So let me give you the basics when it comes to our enamels. For years, if anybody's ever taken a hands-on course with me, I think I used to use the analysis book from Gerard Ubasi. I still think it's a great book, and it's still one of my favorite teaching books, believe it or not. And the reason I've done that is because over the years, when you study how to build teeth or how to make them look real, I've noticed that there were really just three basic types of enamel that the human body possesses. Those three types are milky enamel. That is where the enamel kind of has a whitish frosting. Sometimes it could be the lines of retzius that pass through. Sometimes it could be a whitish calcification. But in the end, it's really more of a milkier look to it, which means that a lot of the light isn't getting deep inside the tooth. The most common amount of translucency or enamel that I see is what we call translucent enamel. And that's where there is some amount of translucency. You can kind of see through the enamel. You could either see some mamelons or some structures or some brightness of the dentin behind it. And I would argue that that's probably out of 80-something% of teeth that we build, that's the kind of focus of enamel that I'm looking for, is a translucent enamel. And then the third type will be a transparent enamel. And that's where the enamel is so thin, so demineralized based on the age, that it's basically a sheet of glass, and you can see everything behind it, whether it's the secondary dentin formation or translucencies or just the fact that there's nothing behind the tooth and you can kind of see right through and get that very gray bluish hue. The good news for us is that the milky is only about 15% and the transparent is only about 15%. So about 60, maybe 70, even up to 80 sometimes % of the restorations that we're working on, translucent is kind of the material that I'm looking for, which means I have to kind of think through which enamels I want. So if I'm using this as a filtration system, what am I trying to do? Well, if I'm building up my structure and I'm building some mamelons, and I want those mamelons to really pop through, then my goal would be to put something more transparency or more translucent over those. But if I want to mask those mamelons that I just built a little bit so they seem a little deeper, then I might use something with a little bit more opacity to it. So if you can kind of pretend what that enamel would look like fired without the dentin behind it fired, you can kind of see the point that I'm making. How much do I want to expose what's behind it? And that's for how I'm really choosing my enamel. I want that kind of a more natural translucency look where I'm exposing some of what's behind it, but maybe I don't want to expose it all. And that's really depending on the age of the tooth, the position of the tooth, and the effects that I'm looking for. So years ago, I did this experiment where I actually made these two different colored dentin crowns, and then I took all the enamel off them. So you're looking at just dentin built up on refractory dyes. And what I did was I came back and I said, you know, I'm going to make veneers over those that are only going to be 0.2 to 0.5 of a millimeter. So they're just pure enamel type veneers. And I did a whole bunch of these because I really wanted to get the feel of the different materials. And the goal, remember, was it was 0.2 to 0.5, and that's all the veneer was pure enamels, no dentins, no other materials in it, what a true veneer is. And I did them with different materials. I did one with just Enamel, I did one with just END, and for those of you who don't know those powders, Enamel is a fairly white enamel. It's a brighter enamel, maybe similar to a 57 or even a Pearl in some kits. END is a lot more of a translucent enamel, maybe more similar to 59s or a warmer type translucent enamel. And then the third set, or actually I made a few sets, but one of the other sets I made is something I call segmented, meaning that I didn't use just one enamel. I might have used 3 or 4. I might have used something with a little amber, something more translucent, a little bit of an Enamel. I mixed it up a little bit like I would really do to kind of get the feel of it. And then I divested those veneers. So what you're looking at is 2/10 of a millimeter to 5/10 of a millimeter. And what I want you to notice here is exactly what I said happens. When I used the whiter, the more brighter type enamel, notice that even by the cervical of those 2 veneers all the way to your left, that they still have that whitish effect to them. Yes, they'll get some color from underneath and they do have translucency to them, but you do realize that they're going to make that a tooth appear brighter or whiter, and you're not going to see as much of the tooth that's behind it after this is bonded on. When I go to the END, which is much more translucent, you'll notice that not only does it appear translucent at 2/10 of a millimeter, but as I come up in the 3 and 4 and 5/10 of a millimeter, I still have all that translucency. So what's that going to mean? That when I put that over a tooth, I'm going to get a lot more bleed through, or a lot more light transmission of what's behind it. And on the segmented, you should notice several different things. You see the color, you see the value, you see some translucencies. And that to me is really how we should be thinking of our enamels, is not just one, right? I always say, you know, for the 2 or 3 powder builder people up there, and I get it, you get used to doing it a certain way. I always say you can't really create nature with just 2 or 3 powders. I know we'd like to, but it doesn't work that way. If you need to add another dentin or a mammal material, and you definitely need to add another enamel or 2 to really make the value of what you're trying to create from the outside to the inside work together. So if I take these same veneers now and I put them on these 2 different colored teeth that I've made, right, and you can see that they're 2 completely different colors, it's kind of interesting to watch. And by the way, just to be clear, I put a little bit of a glazing medium inside the veneer. This is where when I put it on, you get that bond between the 2 materials. So you really see the coloring underneath. And notice what happens as I slide them on. Look at the Enamel over that darker surface, right? It really masks a lot of it. You see a little color coming through, a little warmth, but realistically, you see a much whiter, brighter surface. Now, the exact same tooth with just END on it, now look what happens. I'm getting all the coloration coming through, even the value is dropping towards the incisal edge, and you can see that I'm really seeing everything that's inside the tooth, which maybe I wanted to, depending on the tooth that I'm doing. And then the third tooth there is what we call the segmented buildup. And I think I'll say that one probably looks the best, but you'll notice that it gives you all the information that I wanted to give. I wanted to increase chroma, I wanted to increase value, I wanted to get some translucency and some of the mammal materials coming through. So realistically, that is the ideal scenario. But I think this is really one of the best examples for you to understand what an enamel translucency can and can't do, and how you should be rethinking it a little bit. On the other tooth, that was a little bit of a whiter, brighter tooth, I did the exact same thing. So on the whiter, brighter tooth, just the Enamel, 2/10 to 5/10, you can see I've masked out everything. You really don't see any color underneath. With the END, which is much more translucent, you can see some of the value that was in the middle third, but now look at how much more translucency and mamelon structure you see in that incisal third. And then again, when I go to the segmented one where I've used 4 or 5 different enamels, again, I think that one really looks the best depending on what effect you're looking for, but that's where you really can start to see what the enamels can do and how you use them to emphasize the coloration. And by the way, in the minimally invasive world that we live in today, a lot of the window veneers and micro veneers that I'm doing are only enamel at this point. Matter of fact, this case that I worked on a year or 2 ago, I have to tell you, I probably made it 4 times before I realized that I can't really use any other material but enamel, and I had to figure out how to make the enamel do what I wanted it to do. So in the end, I could tell you that we'll go through the case a little bit. I won't bore you with all the details. We wanted to do a little crown lengthening because I wanted the gingival architecture to be, well, it's a young girl. She's 24 years old. We don't want to prep the teeth out. So we're really just going to take off her enamel and then try to mask a little bit of that color behind it, but also get the same translucency and the same mamelon structures and all those things. So the incisal edge will stay where it is, but I'd like to bring the gingival level up a little bit. And I won't go through all the details of sounding for bone and making sure that we know where the bone is to highlight the tissue, but of course, those are the normal steps that we take. We'll take our normal shade information, and this time 100% My focus is on the number 8 or the 1-1, where that's where I'm really getting all my coloration from. I want to hit that one the best. Obviously, polarize is really important in these photographs. I also referenced this with the Easy Shade, and I'm actually using something called OptiShade more today, which is another interesting shade taking device. But this was a few years ago, so none of those things really applied, although I did use the Easy Shade. But you'll also notice the amount of translucency you're seeing there with the polarized photograph. So think about that concept. I only have 3/4 of a millimeter to work in. This is going to be all enamels. And I'm going to tell you, I wound up using a bunch of different enamels. I used ENL mixed with window. I used some EM3. I used some 9 and 10 EE. I mixed windows and other colors. And in the end, anything that I wanted on the tooth, I actually painted on as I was building it. So I went to accent stains and used that to start to create. This was my first attempt. And then obviously I worked the texture down and worked the Mamelon materials a little bit and wound up finalizing the tooth somewhat around here. And it worked out pretty well. But remember how difficult that is, because all it was 2/10 to about 4/10 of a millimeter, which means I had to do it all with enamels. And how I created that filter became much more challenging for me to work through the process. So there was a good learning curve on this case. And I want to be clear that the learning curve was, this was a case that I had to utilize accent stains and other stain materials to give me the effects I want, because I had no real space to do anything else to work in with Mamelon materials or other colors. I follow this formula a lot today with some of the digital materials. Now, most of you know that I'm a big fan of the Mark II. I always joke and call it Evolve, hint, hint. But I think most of you know that I like this material a lot. And when I use this material very thin, even though in the thicker version of it, it's probably more like a transparent dentin, or maybe close to a dentin opacity-wise, the thinner I make it, the more translucent it becomes. And when I start to use these for window type veneers, like I just did on that young girl that you saw, and in that case was hand built, but sometimes now I can get away with not hand building it and using these press type veneers, or milled veneers, I should say, because they're actually milled ceramic is what they are. And I can utilize them just to fill the spaces that I want and then do the colorization on them, basically as a staining glaze technique. And I find that the coloration works so much nicer on these. I'm sure many of you who make lithium to silicate or silicate veneers, as much as we try to make them look as pretty as we can and put our stains on the outside, I'd argue they never look as nice as a feldspathic veneer could look, especially because the staining seems to really take into the surface much better with the feldspathic veneer. So in a case like this, even though the teeth look a little wide, these are just purely milled with a very little tiny bit of stain on them. And this is on the cementation or the bonding. So you can see the tissue hasn't dropped down all the way yet, but this is just on placement. And again, these are no more than 2 to 5/10 of a millimeter. They're just really that one straight material with a little coloration on them. They blend and harmonize so much better. So for me, all I'm using that enamel for is a filtration system, right? To give me what I want value-wise, and then I control the value with a little bit of stain there as a monolithic type material in the end. Okay, so I think most of you know that when I'm talking about controlling the coloration, I always start from looking at nature. I always say that nature has more chroma in the cervical, which is why I usually want to use more chromatic translucent materials there. The middle third is where you get the greatest value or the most light reflection, which is why I want to use more opacified, or maybe the right word is whiter, brighter type of enamels that are more reflective. And as I get down to the incisal edge, I want to mix and match them. I might want some translucency, I might want some filtration where I'm not getting all the light going through. It really depends on the effect that I'm looking for. So as I build my canvas, I'm going to pick and choose my enamels based on the goal that I'm looking for. Light transmission or light reflection is really the kind of goal that I'm working through. And what's interesting is when you break down, you go back one slide. I didn't mean to do that. Let me just want to go back one slide here. When you break down the angulations of the facial planes of the upper, it's kind of interesting that, think about what I just said: chroma in the cervical, value in the middle third, and translucency in the incisal third. What's kind of coincidental, I guess, although maybe just a long time to figure it out, that those are the same zones of color, those same angulations. So that cervical third is where I usually have the most chroma and translucency. That middle third is where I usually have the most reflectance. And then incisal third is where I have the combination of the effects that I want. So that means that now as I'm building my teeth, I'm actually thinking them zone-wise. And again, this is why you need more than one enamel, because you really need to finish the zones with the coloration that you want those zones to have. So I'm thinking of, again, higher chromas in the cervical, higher values in the middle third, and then more translucencies, values, or chromas in the incisal third, depending on the effect of the age that I'm looking for, okay? So let me finish with one case and kind of put this all together. I think most of you know that when I'm diagnosing my way through my cases, we always start the same: face, white, pink. What does the face look like? Where does the white belong? And how does the pink harmonize around it? We're going to do our normal shade taking processes like we normally would. We're going to provisionalize the patient. She's only doing 4 veneers, and it was mostly for color and closing some of the black triangles. After we worked our way through the functional aspects of the patient and got her happy and set, these were actually done as refractory veneers. So I still do a lot of refractory veneers, especially when I have more space to work in, maybe 6, 7, 8/10 of a millimeter. Then I have control because I know I'm going to finish with 2 to 5/10 of enamel, but I might have 3, 4, 5/10 internally that I can now work through with dentins and mamelons and other materials. So it gives me the best of both worlds. Filtering what I need to filter, but controlling the internal canvas that I'm working on. So I started this case with some opacious type materials, and in this case, I actually used effect chroma materials. So the yellow you see there to the left of your screen is my effect chroma 1, which is a very whitish material. And you'll notice I put that in the center of the tooth and up and down my line angles. So that's for my internal structure. I also extended the tip of that a little bit, either with the EC1 or 2, or maybe sometimes I'll use a chroma plus 1, depending on the shade and value that I'm going for. So that's just giving me a base. And then I'll start with my dentin materials. And I'm going to use more than one dentin. I might use 2 or 3. Obviously, the cervical dentin is higher in chroma. The middle dentin might be a little higher in value. And then the incisal edge is going to be a combination of the 2 of them, depending on the effect and the age that I'm looking for. So I'll do that build up, and I won't walk you through all the boring build up parts, but as I get my canvas set, then I'm going to come back and start adding some of my mamelon type material. So my mamelons are placed. In this case, I might have used 2 or 3 different mamelon materials, but that's kind of standard for me. You don't always have to use that many. I don't like to scare people and think you can't build a tooth without 9,000 powders. Not true. I would also argue you can't build them with 1 or 2. You got to find that middle ground of 3, 4, 5, 6, kind of a concept that you're adding those second in. But the real importance of that is you need to know why you're adding those powders in and what you're using them for. So once I have my canvas complete and I have my mamelon set, now my goal is, how do I filter this? What do I want the light to do? Remember where we started. If I put something very translucent there, that means everything that is on that canvas that you see is going to be very frontal. It's going to be very facial, meaning that the light's going to go right through my translucency or transparency, hit what's there, and the tooth may appear either low in value or possibly slightly dead. Why? Because all the light is going right into that dentin and enamel, and it doesn't have any ability to refract or reflect or kind of make itself do what nature does. So I have to be thinking that I need my 2/10 to 5/10 of enamel. And what am I looking for? Enamels that do the things that I want them to do. Again, more chroma in the cervical, more value in the middle third, and a combination towards the incisal edge to make that work. So I may come back and use something like an effect pearl 1, or maybe just maybe an opal 1 mixed with a little bit of effect pearl, depending on how bright a light that I'm looking for to get that kind of brightness in the center of the tooth. On the angles, I might use an opal material, maybe an EO1, or sometimes I mix a little EO1 or 2, depending on the coloration that I'm looking for. But I don't want to get into the weeds with that. It's not important which one I'm using. What's important is the thought process of what I'm trying to accomplish. Do I want the light to pass through? Do I want some of the light to pass through? Do I want none of the light to pass through? So I'm really thinking it more of what do I want my filter to do? on this tooth as I'm processing through the enamels. And then I'll start going into my normal enamels, maybe some ENLs. I might use a little EE2. It really depends, maybe EE4. It really depends on the effect that I'm trying to accomplish as I work through. And that filtration system is going to allow me to either see what's behind it or not see what's behind it. So I'm going to finish off my enamels. And from that finished enamel that you see there, remember the goal is, what do I want the light to do? Do I want the light to go through that enamel or not through the enamel? That's really the kind of concept that I'm working through at this point. And then I'll finish the restorations. I'll fire them. We'll polish, glaze, texture, typography, all the little details that normally go into our final restoration. And we'll bring these to the patient's mouth. So you can see the doctor has the tissue looking really nice and healthy after he removes the provisionals. And so much so that I took a picture of him inserting one of the veneers. And I want you to look at how nice the tissue looks and how healthy the tissue looks as we insert. And also look at the coloration, meaning that if you look at the natural cuspid that you see there, the number 6 or the 1-3, you'll notice that she has a density to her teeth, meaning that they're not super translucency. Maybe she bleached. She kind of has that whitey, kind of a milky look to the tooth, but you see the chroma, you see the value, and you see a little of that incisal translucency. So I was really trying to follow that, right? You'll notice in my cervical, you see more of a chroma. In the middle third, you kind of see that brightness, and as I get down towards the incisal edge, I'm trying to keep the same density that I see in the adjacent teeth or natural teeth. This way they kind of blend in together. So we'll put those 4 veneers in. She's still a little numb here, but you can see they kind of blend fairly well. And in the end, I think this was all on insertion, so I didn't get the tissue to fill back in at this moment, but it filled in. We're very confident of that based on the marginal positions. And this is on insertion, so she's still kind of numb, but you can see how everything blends. We've got the color that doesn't look too fake or too bright. It blends into the arch and kind of works well for that patient. And of course, she's still numb, so she's looking a little funny as she's trying to smile. So, okay, I think I'm pretty, let's see. Ooh, perfect, 10-2. See that, Jim? Like, I nailed it again, 50 minutes, 54 minutes. With that said,
that was perfect.
I think we'll stop here and hopefully open up for a few questions. I hope I answered or shifted the concept that was thrown out for the enamel translucencies in the right direction. That's the way I see them, and that's the way I try to work through the processes of, it's a protectorant, so I wanted to do what its job is. At the same time, I wanted to do aesthetically what I needed to do, and that's all about translucency, transparency, light reflection, and light absorption. Okay, so I'll stop here, and hopefully there's some questions in the queue for us, Jim.
All right, yes, there is. And just a couple things before we get into the questions. Let me adjust my screen here. Just a reminder, if you're looking for the CE will come to you through an email. We'll use the information that you registered for this webinar on. So give us a couple days and they'll send you that information. The workshop, the webinar has been recorded. Again, it's found on our social media pages, on VITA North America YouTube channel as well. So please go to that and visit all of Peter's previous webinars as well. We've run the gambit. We've done 15, 18 different topics on all sorts of aspects surrounding teeth and ceramics and shade and photography and things like that. So please check those out when you get a chance. If you do need to contact one of the sales reps in your local area, here is a list of them. So please, if you don't see your area, just give us a call and we'll direct you towards the right person. Of course, here we have a helpline. There's Paul and myself. We can help you out. We can also help out with Peter as well. We have Peter coming on other dates as well down the road. These aren't all of his. However, we have plenty of different webinars, different topics throughout the remaining part of this year. So please come visit us again. You should receive another marketing email from us asking you if you wanted to join up on another VITA learning webinar. So please do so. Peter's gracious enough that if you want to email him or give him a call, you can do that. Give him a couple days. He is a busy traveling man, so give him a few days to answer anything. But we will, he's allowed us and you also to throw him some questions, whatever might come up. So as far as questions go, I got a list of it here. A lot of it still surrounds the enamel, translucent enamel. Do you use a specific enamel? You kind of answered that question. Depends on the tooth, I believe, right?
Yeah,
on what you're
although
trying to
my
duplicate.
standard go-to, to be honest with you, that I use probably the most is a combination with the VM9. I'm using Enamel mixed with about 40% window. So that's kind of my standard translucent enamel that I use almost on every case. And if I want to brighten that up, maybe I minus a little of the window. If I want to make it a little more translucent, then maybe I add a little more of the window. So that's kind of my standard skin filter or filtration that I use.
All right, and that's related to another question that we had is, do you mix it? So thank you very much. Another question, out of curiosity, would it be better to use, wouldn't it have been better to use a gum color close to the gingival, to close the gingival margins? You showed an earlier case when you first started, that labial as opposed to a tooth color margin material.
Yeah, I think hygiene is critical there, right? So I think what the person was saying is why didn't we put pink on it to close the spaces? Because hygiene is the most critical aspect there. And then once we do that, then it's hard for the patient to clean and floss. And she had a low lip dynamic, so she's not showing any of that. Also, if I'm misreading the question and really what you're asking is, did I use a pink translucency? The answer to that would be yes also. I sometimes use like in VM9 kit, it's EE3, but I sometimes use a pinker translucency around the cervical, especially for younger teeth. So I'm not sure which direction that question was going, but hopefully I answered it both ways.
Yeah, if not, anyone go ahead and throw in your questions, or if there's a comment that was made that you think you need more elaboration, please let us know. Another question is from for the doctor. Can you explain what the jig is exactly for what the doctor would use for?
Yeah, so especially when you're working with implant cases, right? I mean, the transfer of the information, whether it's digital or analog, I think is challenging. So one of the things we found is that, especially when you're doing single unit implants or multi-unit implants, we want to keep it as simple as possible for the doctor. So basically what Keon does in my office here a lot of times, after the abutment is made and the crown is done, before we send the case out, we actually make a resin jig, kind of like a Maryland bridge that sits on the adjacent teeth, wraps itself around the abutment, and that allows the doctor to unscrew the abutment from the cast, take it off, and actually place it in the mouth with the jig and torque it back down. It helps in a few ways. One, it verifies that the information is accurate right from the get-go, right? When we're working on the case, if the doctor's having trouble getting the crown in, well, we don't know if the teeth moved on the adjacent side or if the implant position wasn't transferred properly. So that's one thing. Also, with a lot of these implants today, the angulation changes on the implant is so much more extreme than it used to be, right? It used to be kind of a hex, and if you moved positions, it was very obvious that it was off. Today, there are such micro gaps that if the implant position is slightly off somewhere, it could be more problematic. So the jig kind of avoids all those problems. And if the doctor can't take it off the mono and put it right in the mouth with the jig, then we know that there's a problem right where it is, and we can stop working through the case. Fortunately, 90% of the time they work out perfectly, and it also makes the doctor's life easier because they're grabbing the jig, not a tiny little implant that they're trying to manipulate in the mouth.
All right, thank you very much. Do you limit your enamel powders to the incisal, or do you also place them in the middle third as well?
So my enamel powders are covering the entire tooth, and that's why I kind of focused on that 0.2 to 0.5 of a millimeter number. Cervically, I need to have translucency there as well, middle third and up. So it starts about 0.2 around the cervical, and you should be finishing around 0.5 towards the incisal edge.
All right. If you are using Mark II or any feldspathic veneer for a veneer, do you ever ask the patient to wear a night guard to prevent chipping?
I don't specifically. I know that's kind of a protocol that I think was adopted in the Dawson Center days back in the day. I would make the argument that, look, patient can break their own teeth, they can break our teeth, right? So our goal is really to protect their teeth, not necessarily ours. If they break or chip a veneer, that might be par for the course, I would argue, but part of our job is to functionally analyze the patient's case. And you need to have the etiology of why things are breaking and chipping. That's why I started off this segment with the functional capability. If you're making veneers on teeth that have high flexural rates or no lingual enamel, you're going to get flexing and you're going to get chipping. So your veneers are going to break because the teeth are already wearing before you got there, and you might want to consider more full coverage. As far as night guards and things, I'm not opposed to them. I know some of my doctors still utilize them, but I think today our goal is really to manage the functional capabilities of the patient and choose the proper material for that patient.
All right. So here's a comment question. It actually kind of relates to what you and I talked about, DS World maybe. What is your recommendation for glazing to preserve the texture, the surface texture? They say most of the time our glaze fades out the surface texture, while we need to have a touch-up of stain, and self-glazing may not be enough.
Yeah, so it's a little problematic when you're in monolithic materials, right? I think I make the argument, some of you probably maybe heard me say this before, that teeth are not glazed. They have a certain luster to them, and every tooth has a different luster to it. Some have a higher luster, some have a lower luster, some have more texture, some have less texture. So I think that's really critical, especially when you're working in 1, 2, or 3 unit kind of cases. When I'm doing a full mouth, I can control all that. So it kind of doesn't matter, I can create it. But when I'm matching natural teeth, I need to really fall into the proper amount of surface typography and the proper amount of luster. So that's part of the equation. The second part of that is the minute I'm in monolithic world and I'm painting stain on the outside of my restoration, I have no choice but to use some sort of a highly fluorescent glazing material, which I do. And you're right, when I do that, what tends to happen is because of the thickness of that material, even though it's microns, it's a few microns, you can lose some of the little surface detail and typography that you put in there. So how do you fix it? Well, 2 ways. One, you might need to be more aggressive with the surface typography to start with, knowing that when I make a little ridge or a groove, that if I make it very thin and I put a few microns over it, I'm not going to see the ridge. So maybe the goal is to make the ridge deeper. So this way, as I'm painting my glaze on, I get more of that internal convexity or concavity that I'm looking for. So that's one way. Second way is after I put my glaze on, I do come back with a rubber wheel and I very lightly go over the surface of it and then polish it. So I'm kind of breaking away a little bit of the glaze that's on there, just so I can get the surface and the ins and outs that I want, and then coming over that with polishing.
All right. For monolithic restorations, would it matter whether the block ingot is opalescent or not?
Show me a true opalescent one. I don't know if it really exists, to be honest with you. I know almost every company is telling you they're opalescent. I'm not sure. I won't go into a long diatribe about opalescence and how it really works and how it's created in fake materials, but I'm not sure that we're really as opalescent as we'd like them to be. It has a lot more to do with the light reflection and so forth. So if the ingots you're using you like and they work well in the mouth and you're getting some of the coloration from underneath, great. But I can't really say that you're truly getting opalescence out of any real ceramic material.
All right. Without a picture, how do you have your dentist describe to you the enamel effect?
I don't, because I have to have a picture because I'm not good enough without it, right? So I get what what you're asking it, and I sympathize with the struggle that you go through. I've gone through it for years, so I'm on your side that you're not getting enough of the information you need. And when you do, it's a bad iPhone picture, or, you know, and I think you, and I'm sure Jim's sick of me talking about photography. I talk so much about it, but that's the reason I do, because in truth, you can't see, you can't create what you can't see. And you can't see what's not documented well with the right photography and the right lighting and the right polarized effects and all those things. So I'm at the point where I'm accepting that I'm not good enough to do things without all the information. And even when I have the perfect information, I'm still not good enough to nail it all the time. I'm still sometimes guessing and twisting. Like I told you, that veneer that I showed you on that young girl, I think I made it 4 times before I felt like it was somewhat in the ballpark. And it made me figure out that I couldn't do it the way I would normally do it. And normally did it was I put a little bit of dent in, some mamelons, and then I tried to get my frame. And then by the time I was done, I had no enamel because I had no space left. And I had to keep kind of taking away and figuring out what directions to go. So I'm sorry to be cold, but photography is the key to the communication.
No, I agree. It's part of our business now.
Has to be.
So do you ever add into your porcelain powders any stain color to help with the translucency effects?
So 100%, I don't really do it for translucency. I really do it more for chromas. So a lot of times, I think I don't know if I've done it in our webinars or not, but in hands-on courses, a lot of times when we're talking about using opacious dentin material or maybe margin material or a fluorescent liner material, how one of the ways that I can manipulate the material is just by adding a stain into the material and increasing the chroma or increasing the value or increasing fluorescence, right? So sometimes it's an easier path to go than to pull out 3 more bottles of powder. I already put down the color that I wanted. I just want to manipulate it a little bit more to get a little bit more chrome or a little bit more fluorescence or value out of it. So yes, I do that quite often. I think if you would ask me that question a year or 2 ago, I would have probably said I do it for dropping value in translucency, but I don't anymore. I've changed that. So I used to, the same margin or liner materials that I was using in my substructure buildup, I would sometimes mix a blue or gray stain in and use that around the incisal edge. I've stopped doing that, and the reason I stopped doing that is because as I've been experimenting going backwards with some fluorescent materials, I'm realizing that our fluorescence is really cervical to mid-third, and it kind of stops before it gets to that incisal edge. So if I'm going to use a staining material, I'm going to use it straight on the coping. And I guess the example that you guys are thinking of is you have a lingual zirconia coping. I'm going to use my color and my fluorescence on that cervical and mid-third. But as I get up to the incisal edge, I don't want any fluorescent materials. I'd rather just use a normal stain if that's the case, if I don't have a lot of space for translucency. In that case, I'll use a gray or blue.
All right, thank you. How would you possibly modify your build up stains if the tooth has abnormal color like gray color in case of tetracycline condition without losing the overall value?
Yeah, I actually have one of those on my bench right now, a tetracycline cane case. So the good and bad news is, and again, just honesty, I'm not trying to be cold to the answers, I just want to be straight to the point for you guys. Certain colors are easier to hide. So ambers, sometimes oranges, maybe almost into the brown family, you can kind of mask fairly well. And I usually mask them either with more opacified materials, depending on how much space I have, or by sometimes adding a more fluorescent stain into one of those materials to create a little fluorescence in that area to change the light reflection. Flaw is when you have darker colors, the grays, the blues, those deep reds, very difficult to hide them and mask them with ceramic materials. So in those cases, to be honest with you, you're much better off going with more full coverage restorations. And even those are problematic, especially for zirconias and lithium silicate. I still do PFM when I need to. So sometimes in cases like that, I'll go full coverage and use PFM as a thin bull coping and then build from there. But I have to be honest and tell you that when you get into the dark grays and the blues and sometimes the dark browns, very difficult to hide them. The other answer is internal bleaching. So the other option there is you internal bleach the tooth, meaning that if the tooth is already root canal, you have the doctor open up the root canal and inject bleach into it and actually brighten the tooth up from the inside to get rid of some of those colorations.
Right. How often do you layer your porcelain over the incisal third only? I think kind of related to an earlier question. I think the question is, of all your cases, do you layer your porcelain over the incisal 1/3 only, or you mentioned you go all the way down to the cervical with some of your enamel porcelains, but.
Yeah, so I know, it's funny because I think, Jim, you know this already. The profession is pushing us for micro layering everything and doing less and less building, and I get that. And as I travel around to different labs and different groups, I'm hearing more and more of it. And the excuse I usually hear is we can't find anybody to build, so we're just making it as simple as possible. You heard my argument. My argument is you teach them how to use a mouse, you could teach them how to use a brush. So it's a bad excuse. But to be honest with you, in my lab, I definitely do micro layering, probably more than I ever did before, but I'm also still building a lot of my cases. And I think that's why a lot of the doctors that come to us, I think there were 4 notes on my desk for new doctors who have called this week that want to work with us that we just can't work with, right? Because we're too busy. And most of them who come and call are calling with the questions of, I hear you're still layering, I want things to look a little bit different. So to answer your question, I'm still layering a good amount of my cases, but I'm also micro layering and really minimal micro layering on other cases, depending on the scenario.
All right, thank you very much. Well, thanks, Peter, very much for your program today. Any last words, any last comments to the audience?
No, thank you for this topic. It's you challenged me with some of the topics, and it's hard for me to figure out how to approach them sometimes, but it's kind of fun, I have to admit, because having you guide me on them makes it a little interesting for me to come up with a way to fill it. So it's kind of a fun challenge. So thank you for the topic. I hope I hit all the points that everybody wanted to know from it. I look forward to seeing some people at some shows. I think I'm going to be in Oregon in October, hopefully Vegas in September, and then I'm international. I'm in Wales and London and Germany and then Mexico, I think, in October, November. But look forward to some more webinars and seeing some people face to face.
Nice. All right. Well, I want to thank you again, Peter, for doing today's webinar. It was great knowledge. Appreciate all the time that you provide, given more educational as opposed to, hey, just look at my cases. You explain how it's done as well. So I think everyone appreciates that from you. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. Join us again for another future VITA Learning webinar. And this will conclude today's webinar. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jim. Take care.
Thanks.